Copyright 2018 by Black Label Logic, all rights reserved. No part of this publication may be reproduced, distributed, or transmitted in any form or by any means, including photocopying, recording, or other electronic or mechanical methods, without the prior written permission of the publisher, except in the case of brief quotations embodied in critical reviews and certain other non-commercial uses permitted by copyright law. For permission requests, contact the publisher at blacklabellogic.com. Introduction. It's been almost 2 years since I first published Gendernomics, and when I sat down to write this book, I didn't really know what I wanted it to be. I knew I wanted it to be more practically applicable than Gendernomics because what I did in Gendernomics was to outline not only the sexual marketplace in aggregate in the first section of the book, I also explained how each individual man should act and proceed within it. So, when I decided to write a second book in the series instead of something else, I didn't want to repeat myself and step on my own toes. Self-improvement is central to red pill theory, and in many ways it is the foundation for things to come. That the manosphere is filled with great content creators that can help you fix virtually any area of your life, whether you are struggling with personal finance, want to fix your marriage, want to live life as a playboy free of chains and concerns, want more muscle, less fat, fix your style, your grooming, or simply want fraternity. For every area of a man's life, we have a content creator, and as a man who has used their content on more than one occasion, I'm very grateful and honored to be part of the same space as so many great men who are all experts within their domain. I've used content from these men to greatly improve my style, grooming, health and diet, body language, voice, communication skills, sexual life, business skills, physical appearance, and many others. When I sat down to write this book, my first idea was to write a book based on my own journey of building value, covering a broad range of topics from approaching to Zeitgeber, but then I thought, why should I write a generic book covering such a wide range of topics when there are many men who have the topics as their main domain and who have written much more and much better content on that topic than I could ever hope to cover a single book. This got me to thinking about some of the work I do regularly. There are hundreds of companies that offer strategy consulting, brand building, vision statement creation, risk analyses, and various other components of a necessary corporate process. However, there are virtually none that offer a comprehensive total package that coordinates all the processes that lead to successful strategic implementation. As a man who has at various times dove into the sea of self-improvement, I've noticed a tendency that when a man first finds our little corner here in the great blue nothing, he wants to fix every area of his life and he wants it done yesterday. This enthusiasm is both endearing and inspiring, but frequently also a source of negative effects, because they are trying to do too much too fast. I'm reminded of a former coworker who came to me after New Year's one year with the message. This year I'm turning my life around, I've quit sugar, tobacco, caffeine and got a gym membership. I'm going to lose 100 pounds of fat, gain 50 pounds of muscle, sort my style out, and by the end of the year I'll be ripped, muscular, swimming in women and will have the life I always wanted. About 2 months later he crashed and burned. Last time I checked up on him, he was still a heavy smoker and at least 100 pounds overweight with no girlfriend but a heavy Fortnite addiction. This man could have had the life he wanted if he focused on fixing things in the best possible order, with his main focus being on ticking off the bigger boxes in descending order while handling the low-hanging fruit along the way. When men find our little corner on the web, they may be the lucky ones who are still in their late teens and early 20s who have malleable minds, few investments and haven't had much time to do damage. These men can make life-altering changes in a year, perhaps even in just a few months because they haven't had much time to screw up their life. The men who come to our space in their 30s, 40s, perhaps even 50s and 60s may find themselves with a much longer journey ahead of them for the simple reason that they have had decades to screw up their life. They may be coming out of a harrowing divorce where they've been zeroed out in their 40s and 50s, after having been married for 20 to 30 years, compensating for their dead bedroom with food and beer, while being deeply invested in their conditioning. These men have a much longer journey ahead of them. This book is mainly for them, though it can also be used by younger men with a desire to plan for their sexual market value peak in their 30s and perhaps even 40s. Thus, my goal with this book is to offer a process by which men can structure many avenues of self-improvement that is complementary to the great content many men have created. Whether it's diet and weightlifting, personal finance, style, grooming, financial freedom, game, understanding intersexual dynamics or a combination of them, the process I've added to this book will help to ensure that your efforts reflect your results. A short note on the structure of the book. As with business textbooks, I've structured this book similarly to Gendernomics, which was split into one part covering macroeconomics and one part covering microeconomics. Gendernomics 2 is split into two main parts, one that outlines my conceptualization of value. Adapted from a series on blacklabellogic.com entitled On Value. that aims to clear up some of the many problems that men run into when we speak and think about value. Whether that comes in the form of different definitions, as is often the issue with constructs such as alpha, mixing up constructs such as human worth with sexual market value, and the difference between a judgment of value and a value judgment. Section 2 begins with the chapter, Past, Present and Future, which is an adaptation of a previous essay published under the title, The Trinity. This essay covers the fact that many men permit their past to have undue influence over their present behavior, and thus their future result, and discusses the importance of your past acting to inform and shape your present actions and future plans, but not to permit it to determine them. Any man who has sought to change his life must understand that if you keep repeating negative behaviors and patterns of thought that you internalized in your past, this will continue to affect your present behavior and the results you achieve in the future. Section 2 is dedicated to the process I've created for efficient and effective self-improvement and that I've used myself at varying stages of my life, including recently finally getting control over my weight after struggling with it for a long time. Finally, in the last section of the book, I conduct a sample case of Dave, where the process is applied to fixing a man who is a complete train wreck in every way possible as related to both his value as a man and his sexual market value. Best regards. Carl. Contents. Section 1. An introduction to the marketplace. On value. Defining value. Subjective versus objective value. Contextual value. Volatility and sticky values. Tangible and intangible asset values. Internal and external value multipliers. Choice criteria and value. Value judgments and judgments of value. Valuation of self and others. The sexual stock market. Predictable versus probabilistic. A deterministic solution to a probabilistic problem. Male value. Section 2. Factors of self-improvement. Present, past, and future states. Vision and mission. Internal and external analysis. Barriers and enablers. Strategy formulation. Critical success factors. Critical activities. Designs, systems, and processes. Example case study. Introduction. Vision and mission. Internal analysis. External analysis. Barriers and enablers. Strategy formulation. Critical success factors. Critical activities. Designs, systems, and processes. Summary and conclusion. Description of techniques. SWOT analysis. PESTLE analysis. Core competencies. Gap analysis. Process mapping. Value chain analysis. Critical path mapping. Porter 5 forces analysis. Black label logic adapted Boston growth share matrix. Core competencies. Final words and acknowledgements. Section 1. An introduction to the marketplace. A person finds themselves in many marketplaces throughout their day. In a given day, you are in the job market, the financial market, the food market, and many others. What makes something into a market is that interactions among actors take place in order to increase the marginal utility of each person. The simplest means of explaining this is through analogy. If one man has a lot of ham, and another man has a lot of bread, their individual holdings give them a certain degree of marginal utility in the form of the food energy available to them. However, if the men were to trade some bread for some ham, they would both increase their marginal utility because they would have greater variety in their diets. Thus, a market is any situation wherein two or more people interact in order to exchange goods, services, or something else in order to improve their own situation. This is the foundation of subjective value theory as outlined by Ludwig von Mises. Each party views what the other party can offer them as having more value than what they have, and are willing to trade for it. Markets can be very simple, or they can be infinitely complex. A local barter economy is often quite simple with few exogenous variables affecting it, other than those beyond human control such as weather. A modern international financial market, on the other hand, is a highly complex system of interdependent, dependent and independent variables, making it very hard to understand, predict and operate within. Something as simple as a local drought in a single country can affect every other country on the planet if the affected country is a major producer of a sought-after consumer good. Perhaps one of the more challenging aspects of markets is the moral dimension added to what is inherently an amoral system created to manage resources in the most efficient manner. The market produces outcomes that are unfair to some degree because of its inherent nature. Within any market, the best outcomes are achieved by those who operate in those markets with the highest degree of competency. Being the most competent actor within a market is not as simple as being the best at the task that you are doing, for instance being a great accountant or trader. It means being competent at that task, and those things that are task adjacent. For instance, being good at networking as a trader or being solution-oriented and pragmatic as an accountant. This is often when the moral dimension is introduced, because human beings can accept others being better at us at a given task. After all, we have no problem with being beaten in a race by a professional sprinter, or in a boxing match by a professional boxer. However, we often dislike when we lose a competition where we view the reasons for our defeat as being things external to the specific task. In the case of the boxer having their diet dialed in better or having connections with a solid promoter that gets him better matches. These were the differences in outcomes that lead Marx to write his Communist Manifesto. He recognized that within a market-oriented system, largely based on competence hierarchies, there would always be differences in outcomes. From Marx's perspective, these differences in outcomes could only arise from one party exploiting another party. After all, if all humans are equal, then it follows that all humans should produce equal value. Thus, a simple conflation of human value with human worth leads a seasoned rhetorician from bedrock to bedlam. The market that this book is largely centered upon is the sexual marketplace, meaning the market in which humans seek out mates. If one assumes human beings are rational, goal-oriented actors with preferences in their economic life, one must also assume that they on some level are rational, goal-oriented and preference-having actors in their sexual life. This is not to say that we as a species always make conscious, explicit chains of reasoning when it comes to mate selection. In fact, I would argue something quite different. However, one cannot deny that there are patterns of preference that are quite significant when observed out in the wild. We are all familiar with the idea of having a type, which means a preference for dating people who have a specific or multiple shared traits, such as hair color, height, body type, or ethnicity. We can also point to preferences that appear innate, such as the preference among human males for the 0.7 hip-to-waist ratio in women. One can also point to hypergamy, in sociology defined as a tendency among women to marry up, but greatly expanded upon by Rollo Tomassi of The Rational Male, as an underlying apparently biological drive in the human female. The Tomassi definition of hypergamy, appearing to have two different levels. Level 1, women seek to optimize their mate choice by selecting mates that have a higher value relative to their own within a given bound. Level 2, women seek to optimize the trade-off between high-value genetics and long-term security and provision. The first level is what is encapsulated in what I've named a woman's hurdle rate, which is a term I borrowed from corporate investment analysis, where an investment has to have a return at a given percentage above the company cost of capital. In Gendernomics terms, the hurdle rate represents the minimal amount of sexual market value a man must have in order to qualify as a potential mate in the eyes of an individual woman. One could argue that women who are more promiscuous have a lower hurdle rate, and women who are less promiscuous have a higher hurdle rate. Ceteris paribus. The second level is a risk management technique. From the perspective of nature, women have one role, to give birth to and raise children. From the perspective of natural selection, women have one role as well, to serve as a bottleneck for the experimentation that it does on men. Biology has demonstrated that men have a greater variation in their genetics than women. For instance, when it comes to IQ, women cluster more around the mean, whereas men have more geniuses and more idiots. From the perspective of seeking to optimize the human species for survival and reproduction, this makes a great deal of logical sense. A woman can only get pregnant once a year and have a reproductive window of at most 20 years, age 15 to age 35 or thereabouts. A man on the other hand can impregnate multiple women every day. Thus, it makes a great deal of sense that nature would experiment on men, and allow the women to serve as the ones who determine what was a successful experiment and which experiments failed. However, this does require that female sexuality have a built-in filtering mechanism that excludes low-value men from the equation. Thus, for a man just entering the sexual marketplace, without any knowledge of intersexual dynamics, or the red pill praxeology, he is a blind man in the land where the one-eyed man is king. To draw a parallel to my own experience entering the corporate world, I was raised to believe in fairness, and that if you were competent, hardworking and consistent in your efforts to do your tasks, that would lead to success. However, after a few years working corporate jobs, I began to notice that competency to some extent was a requirement, but the best accountant rarely became CFO, the best technical person never made CTO, and the most competent COO rarely became CEO. This is sometimes called Putt's Law, but what it means is that the people above are operating very well within their sphere of competence, but they lack the complete perspective. There are other skills other than task competence that are required to progress beyond their current position. To be an executive or a manager requires a skill set of its own, Machiavellianism to some degree, the ability to direct people, to be disliked, and to perform within the bounds of office politics. It requires strategic and tactical ability, and more than perhaps anything else, it requires an ability to see oneself at the same time as both part of a system and as an individual. This is much like how a man who listens to his mother about how to act with girls will most likely come away with the idea of being the generous, chivalrous, perfect gentleman that always pulls the chair out for women, never holds them accountable, and acts as an enabler for the woman's vision. These are good traits to have. They will result in a decent level of social competency, good manners, and few women will have anything negative to say about him, however few will want to select him as their mate sans other masculine traits. In both cases, the person is a solid product, but they are not positioned for the right market. The task-oriented, competent, conflict-avoidant, dutiful employee who never steps on anyone's toes has to change in order to appeal to the executive market rather than the great team player market. The perfect gentleman will have to change in order to appeal to the mating market rather than the provider market. I prefer a value chain-oriented approach to the sexual marketplace, in that in order to become the best product that you are capable of, you will have to begin by determining your present product value and then work your way backwards to the inputs in order to establish what must change. The graph above is very simplified, and when you design your own it will without a doubt be much more complex. However, I find that the simplified graph works well to highlight the three major areas a man must be aware of during his journey in the sexual marketplace. The inputs are his given benefits and negatives, the process represents the work he does to maximize his benefits and minimize his negatives, and the market is the sales process he engages in when interacting in the sexual marketplace. This book is focused on step 2, on value. This chapter is a partial reprint of an essay I posted some time ago where my goal was to lay out the many conceptualizations of value that exist in order to bring additional clarity to the concept of sexual market value. There is much confusion about this concept, and as it is a central one to this book, I find that clarity is of utmost importance. Men are naturally highly competitive, and as a result we tend to always want to position ourselves at the top of a hierarchy. This can often lead to us neglecting future results in order to feel good in the moment, such as the teenager who loads up 415 on the bench press, does a quarter rep with 2 of his friends spotting, and claims to have a 415 bench, instead of just lifting an amount of weight that he can do 5 to 12 reps with for 3 to 5 sets, consistently over time, and thus make progress. There are 2 ways to define high mate value in men. One is trait-based, which is the classic way of doing alpha and beta. We have a series of traits that go intro a construct called alpha, such as dominance, disagreeableness, lack of neuroticism, confidence, and so on. We also have a series of traits that go into a construct called beta, such as submissiveness, agreeableness, neuroticism, lack of confidence, and so on. Then we measure each man relatively on each trait and come out with a conclusion. This method works very well for theoretical discussions. The second is outcome-based, and I think this is the better one of the two for empirical observation and to serve as a baseline for your own value. The outcome-based definition is simply how easy is it for you to sleep with women to whom you are attracted. If I airdropped you into a new city where you have never been before, you have the same lifestyle you currently have, how long would it take you to find a mate? I prefer this to the notch count or adventure sex measurement, because that biases the results against men who are alpha, yet prefer serial monogamy, or have more conservative sexual preferences. The reason why I prefer the second one as a starting point is that it leaves less room for self-delusion than the trait-based definition of alpha. After all, it's very easy to quality oneself, and disqualify other men from the construct by adding in aspects of community, morality, and religion which are valuable traits and does contribute to a man's overall value, but have little influence on his sexual market value. Genghis Khan, for instance, was an alpha male by virtually any measure, a leader of men, a warlord who created one of the biggest empires in the history of man, had hundreds if not thousands of children throughout his life, and wealth that is virtually unrivaled in history. However, considering he did so by waging war, raping and pillaging across 2 continents, I doubt we could argue that he was a moral paragon. The reason for the reprint, and this introduction, is that in order for you to get any useful progress from the methodology outlined in later chapters, it's important to know where you are starting out. It doesn't matter if you're in the middle of a 24-month slump, or if you kicked a girl out of your house to continue reading this book. What matters is being honest with yourself about your current situation. Defining value. In order for the remainder of this essay to make sense, a definition of value is required, as there are quite a few different definitions of value depending on in which context it is used. Merriam-Webster Dictionary has a full 7 different definitions, out of which 5 are both relevant and utilized throughout this essay. 1. The monetary worth of something. Market price. This is the primary definition, which I will use throughout this essay, especially when speaking about the interactions between values within a marketplace. One should keep in mind that monetary worth is not a unit of measure that can be easily applied in the sexual marketplace outside of prostitution. Instead, it refers to the rough mean of a person's sexual market value. 2. A fair return or equivalent in goods, services, or money for something exchanged. This is the primary definition used under choice criteria, and when talking about trades and interactions. In essence, in order for an exchange to take place, each party must view themselves as getting a fair exchange, otherwise they will not be willing to make a trade. 3. Relative worth, utility, or importance, a good value at the price. The definition above is in many ways related to definition 2, in that they both deal with exchanges. However, 3 offers an additional variable, which is satisfaction at making what one perceives as getting more than a fair deal. 4. Something, such as a principle or quality, intrinsically valuable or desirable. Definition number 4 can represent those variables of which value is created, such as quality, or other factors that are the totality of the choice criteria. 5. A numerical quantity that is assigned or is determined by calculation or measurement. This definition gets to the heart of the simple 1 to 10 sexual market valuation scale that is almost universally utilized among men. While this is a subjective scale to an extent, the law of large numbers should mean that as the number of observations goes up, the value trends towards the mean. Subjective versus objective value. One of the chapters in Gendernomics is dedicated to subjective and objective value theory. The major distinction between the two is that from the perspective of objective value theory, one can for every good and service establish a value, which is mind-independent. For instance, if one makes sprockets for a living, the combination of fixed costs, rent, electricity, equipment, and variable costs, labor, materials, is your total product cost. As your production volume goes up, the fixed cost allocation to each sprocket goes down, something which is referred to as economies of scale. When you then bring your product to market, you run into subjective value theory, which is often unrelated to objective product value. The market can value your product at less than your cost of production, more than cost of production, and equal to your cost of production. The deterministic men want sexual market value to be an objective criteria, as this offers security and concrete milestones for them to work towards. The 437 bullet point lists that are often presented as what women want in a man are examples of such criteria that are perceived as objective by men who are of a deterministic mindset. Likewise, they seek objective ways to value a woman, in the form of various How to Vet a Wife articles or similar guides that offer what they perceive as mind-independent frameworks for how to judge a woman's present and potential value. From the perspective of objective value theory, this makes sense, as according to this theory everything has an objective value that one must seek to know in order to proceed with the trade. From the perspective of subjective value theory, this makes much less sense, as one's valuation of the same thing may differ across time and context. If you are presently dying of thirst, you would value a bottle of water much more highly than if you were sitting next to a stream of clear and crisp mountain water. The customer generally does not care what your margin is, or how much it costs you to produce a good or service. They care how much you want to charge them for it, and how much they think it's worth to them. The perspective of subjective value theory always views value as being in flux and depending upon a range of other variables. A woman who appears to be of high value at present may be low value in a different context, just as a man who is of high value now may decrease or increase in value depending on his actions across time. A man who gets married at 25, gains 100 pounds, and loses all his money in a divorce at 35, have reduced his value in those 10 years. A man who never got married, never put on weight and still has all his financial resources will have increased in value. However, this does not mean that every woman will rate him in an identical manner as a romantic prospect. This depends on her own internal valuation mechanism, as I explain in my first book Gendernomics. Every SMV valuation is subjective, yet tends to conform within a range, meaning that a woman who is 10 to 8 men will also be in the top percentiles of SMV for other men. A man, who is SMV 10 to 8 women, will most likely be in the top percentiles for other women as well. This is no reason to reject beauty standards, or standards of behavior based on a snowflake fallacy, but rather to accept that while you can never fully predict the thoughts and actions of a human, in aggregate they form patterns that confirm a near-objective SMV valuation across the global market. As I outlined in the paragraph above, every individual valuation of the sexual market value of another will be subjective. However, when one aggregates those valuations, they form market patterns of value. This is a consequence of, as the number of valuations increase, their distribution will tend towards the mean. The mean I refer to here is the mean of the aggregate sum of valuations, not the mean of sexual market value. For instance, if 10 women rate a man as a 3, and 10 women rate him as a 5, the mean of his valuation is 4. However, the mean of every valuation of every person will tend to cluster around SMV 5, which is the mean of the 1 to 10 scale. Perhaps the most interesting aspect of contrasting subjective and objective value theory is that in order for a trade to take place, only subjective value theory works. This is due to the fact that for a trade to take place, one party must view what the other person has as more valuable than what they have, and vice versa. Contextual value. In various forms of business, one will often experience conflicting valuations in some form or another. In finance, it's quite clear from the outline in an upcoming section of this post that there can be many different valuations for a company. Likewise, within marketing one can have differing valuations for a new product or a market depending on the underlying premises one utilizes when conducting an analysis. A common method to establish the potential market size for a brick-and-mortar business is to determine how many people live in the area where the business will operate, then how many of those are potential customers and how frequently they will need the services offered by the company. In this simple mathematical problem, the definitions of operating area, potential customers, and frequency of service will greatly affect the valuation of the project. The idea of contextual value is that things outside of an item influence the value placed upon that item by rational actors. The simplest example is how an item for which there is high demand tends to be viewed as more valuable than an item for which there is little if any demand. Some prefer to look at demand as an indicator of value, meaning that high-value products will also have a correspondingly high demand. However, this is a conflation of a product's capability for satisfying a need with the product's popularity. While one can easily argue that there are correlations between product quality and product popularity, the correlation between the variables are varied. It is entirely possible to have a low-quality product, for which there is high demand, or a high-quality product for which there is low demand. Within the dating sphere, this often takes the form of social proof, which as a variable influences the value of the product either up or down. However, social proof is transitory, as it is composed of variables that communicate and signal high value within a social group. Thus, many of the factors that lead to high social proof are in and of themselves a part of the product. They are in fact the joint subjective perceptions of the product communicated externally. Fiat currency, currency not backed by tangible assets, is an example of something which derives almost the entirety of its value from perception, in that it has value because everyone in a group agrees that it has value. It used to be that every note of a currency was the equivalent of a deposit slip for a given amount of precious metal. For instance, the British pound sterling supposedly got its name from coins minted from silver in the Saxon Isles, and where large payments would be denoted in pounds of sterling. If people were to calculate the production value of modern banknotes, the inputs to production would be much less in value than the face value, and thus currency is in many ways an abstract idea. The need for more stable forms of currency arose from the simple fact that barter is not only time-consuming, but also from the need to have more permanent stores of wealth. An apple farmer a few hundred or thousands of years ago held his wealth in the form of perishable fruit that ripened with the season, and as a result he would be very wealthy in apples during the apple harvest. However, at this time supply of apples would be high, thus he would obtain less in exchange for his apples than he would a few months later. On the other hand, not being able to barter all his apples meant that he would be unable to acquire the goods he and his family would need, as the apples would spoil. Thus, there was a need for a more permanent store of wealth, which is why currency was invented. The downside of currency being that it gains part of its value from the fact that it is a medium of trade. Even with silver and gold, they were only truly valuable as mediums of trade. It is quite recent that these metals have found value in electronics. Many people who prepare for the impending downfall of society, for this reason elect to store wealth in a mixture of precious metals and in various goods they assume people will require after society collapses. This can be foodstuffs with long shelf lives, medicines, ammunition, and various others. Thus, some items gain their value because they are perceived as having value, rather than some innate, non-negotiable aspect of their being. How we view value depends on a mixture of the objective and subjective as mentioned earlier in this essay. Certain characteristics of an object are directly of that object independent of our subjective valuation, while other characteristics are less tangible. For instance, an iPhone as a product has a certain objective value based on the needs it satisfies and the need of a person to sate that need. However, their preference to satisfy this need through either an iPhone or an Android-based product depends on the person's subjective valuation. Likewise, the value difference between two phones with the exact same objective characteristics may differ based on subjective perceptions. For instance, those who value coolness may prefer an iPhone due to the brand image of Apple. A person may prefer Coke to Pepsi due to nostalgia or habit. The box the iPhone comes in does not add significant value to the product itself, but it affects our perceptions of the product. Such effects on value can be either positive or negative. For instance, one would tend to value a meal at a sit-down restaurant higher than one from a drive-thru, regardless of product characteristics because of the context. Likewise, the context in which we view the iPhone will affect our valuations of its objective characteristics. The low battery life compared to other products is important for those who are unable to charge their phones for longer periods of time. Likewise, the ease with which the screen can be broken or the sensitivity to humidity may affect the valuation of it compared to alternatives. Volatility and sticky values. Anyone who makes a habit out of following various indexes on stock markets, individual shares, or even consumer goods, will be aware of volatility to some extent. In essence, the volatility of an asset is a measure of how much it tends to fluctuate in price over time. A highly volatile asset will see higher and more frequent fluctuations than a less volatile asset. The blue-chip stocks mentioned earlier in the essay are examples of a less volatile asset when compared to smaller, growth-based companies. I've previously compared